Good morning and welcome to the Connecticut United Ways virtual Alice Town Hall on affordable housing and homelessness prevention. My name is Lisa Tepper Bates and I'm the President and CEO of United Way of Connecticut. In early September, Connecticut United Ways released the 2020 Alice Report, the fourth such report for the state of Connecticut, a report on families who are asset limited, income constrained, and employed. The Alice Report revealed that even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, a full 38% of Connecticut households were walking a financial tightrope and struggling to make ends meet. When we talk about these households, when we talk about Alice, it's important to recognize that we all know Alice. Alice is the essential healthcare worker caring for our aging parents at home and for COVID patients in our hospitals. Alice is the teaching assistant who helped our children adapt to virtual learning, or the bus driver who gets our kids to school. Alice fixes our cars and works in our local shops and restaurants. Alice is our friend, our neighbor, our coworker, and a family member. We and our economy lean on Alice for support in a number of ways. Yet right now, Alice households are struggling like never before to feed their families, access affordable child care, insure for their medical care, and maintain their housing. The focus of our Alice Town Hall today is this last category of basic need, housing. The 2020 Alice Report identified housing as the single largest monthly expense for single adults and the second largest expense for families with young children after childcare. As a nationally recognized leader in efforts to address homelessness, Connecticut recognizes the importance of a stable home. And with steady investments of state resources by the administrations of both Governor Ned Lamont and Governor Daniel Malloy before him, with leadership from the Department of Housing and a tremendous team effort by nonprofits and state agency partners, Connecticut achieved a 40% reduction in annual homelessness between 2014 and 2020. However, a growing number of households in Connecticut are facing challenges in accessing and affordably maintaining adequate housing. While all this was quite clear to us before the COVID-19 pandemic, the public health emergency has only served to underscore how critically important it is for all Connecticut residents to have safe and adequate housing. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, a typical two-bedroom apartment requires a household to earn an hourly wage of more than $26 per hour. The Alice Report revealed that 45% of workers in Connecticut earn less than $20 per hour. And only 2 of the top 20 jobs in our state pay enough to support the Alice household survival budget for a family of 4, a budget that includes the cost of housing. Given this growing gap between rent and wages, it's no surprise that nearly 120,000 Connecticut households, the majority of whom are Alice, spend more than half their income on rent. We cannot continue to ask our Alice households to choose between food for their families, care for their children, or a roof over their heads. A safe, stable place to call home is the cornerstone of a stable life for children and adults alike. With all this in mind, the Connecticut United Ways are thrilled to bring together today 4 housing experts to discuss with us the need for more investment in homelessness prevention and in affordable housing, and to discuss solutions that can help our state better meet the needs of families who are struggling to maintain their housing. We're pleased to welcome to the panel this morning, Commissioner Seila Mosquera Bruno of the Connecticut Department of Housing, Dr. Vanessa Lills, PT Partners, PT Power, and First Selectman Matt Hoy, Town of Guilford. I'd like to thank Kylie Gosselin in particular, Executive Director of the Partnership for Strong Communities, who will serve as our moderator. Thank you for making time to join our Alice Town Hall this morning. Thank you to all of our panelists. And thank you for supporting the Connecticut United Ways. Together, we can create more stable housing for residents across this state. Now I'll turn it over to Kylie. Thank you, Kylie, for helping to set the stage with regard to this issue and to moderate the panel discussion.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Lisa. Thank you, everybody, for joining us early this morning. My name is Kylie Goslin, and as Lisa said, I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Strong Communities here in Connecticut. We're a policy and advocacy organization dedicated to ending homelessness and expanding housing opportunity in the state. I'd like to introduce today's panelists. Lisa already shared their names, but let's put some faces to those names. So this morning, let's please welcome our Commissioner of Housing, Selah Mascara-Bruno. Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
Thank you. And welcome Dr. Vanessa Lyles of PT Partners. Hello, am I saying your name right, Dr. Lyles?
Yes, you are. It is Dr. Lyles. Thank you so much. Please
Great. Thank you for joining us today. And today we had the First Selectman, Matt Hoey of Guilford, who is scheduled to join us. He is unable to. He has his mighty town planner, George Crawl, here in his place. George, are you there? I'd say, okay, it looks like George is unable to join us. So I'll get started with my remarks and then we'll move into the panel while we work that out. So again, thanks for joining us today. We'll be having a conversation around affordable housing in Connecticut and the 2020 Connecticut United Ways ALICE report, which we'll get into a little bit more in a minute. So thanks to all of you who joined us again. I'd like to encourage you to interact with one another in the chat room, and you're also invited to submit questions for the Q&A portion of the program there as well. So let's talk for a second about affordable housing. As I mentioned, the Partnership for Strong Communities is a statewide policy and advocacy organization. We have two campaigns, one called Reaching Home, which has been in place for more than 15 years, which Lisa knows well, dedicated to ending homelessness across the state, and another, Home Connecticut, also, which has been in place for about 15 years, dedicated to expanding affordable housing. And as Lisa accurately mentioned, there's been some tremendous progress on the homelessness side. As she noted, a wide coalition of partners, both nonprofit and state, as well as philanthropic entities, our coordinated access network, partners like United Way that help run the state's 211 system, which many of you may be familiar with, really have come together in the last decade to strategically identify policy solutions and work to drive those numbers down of people experiencing homelessness in our state. Today, we have anywhere between 3,000 to 5,000 individuals estimated experiencing homelessness coming through our state's homeless crisis service system. And of course, the pandemic has strained that, and we'll get into that more later as well. But aside from those thousands of individuals experiencing homelessness on the extreme end of housing instability, there's another several 100,000 individuals in this state who are rent burdened or extremely rent burdened. Those are individuals spending 30 or sometimes more than 50% of their income on rent. And there's a big overlap between that population and the ALICE report individuals that Lisa so aptly described, those income constrained employed individuals, asset limited. For those individuals, the pandemic has been a true nightmare. For those individuals who've lost employment, who are in that category before, it has sent many households into crisis mode. In fact, we estimate now, along with federal partners, that the need for rental assistance in Connecticut, arrearages, and current rent alone exceeds $400 million in this state at this time. What we need in Connecticut, and we know, is a diversity of housing options, including multifamily rental and affordable units that are actually restricted. And this has been a challenge for Connecticut for some time. We know that we have the 10th highest housing costs in the nation here in the state of Connecticut. And we also have some of the 5th oldest housing stock. Our multifamily housing is aging and it's in need of repair. We also have low housing starts here in Connecticut. approximately, we rated, second to last in permit issuance with a rate of 1.3 permits per 1,000 people. So our ability to produce units here in Connecticut has been restricted, which has also created a challenge for families trying to identify rental units and units that are affordable to them, in addition to affordable home ownership units. And we know too that the benefits for creating these affordable units or creating a diversity of housing options are plenty. For every $1 we spend on multifamily housing and construction, it creates another $4.57 for $4.57, I should say, in other benefits for our economy in terms of jobs alone. And with that affordable housing, we know that families have an estimated $7,000 additional dollars of disposable income that they can use to spend on additional necessities like food, clothing, and childcare. So affordable housing is not just important to put roofs over heads and keep people safe, an element that has been underscored in our current pandemic situation, but it's also critical for Connecticut's economy. As we know, opposition to affordable housing in Connecticut and just multifamily housing and housing density has been a hurdle for our ability to create the housing that our residents need and our economy needs. Barriers in the form of individual zoning in our 169 Connecticut towns has hindered growth and opportunity, and also created challenges in segregation. We know that Connecticut is also one of the most segregated states here in the country, and that housing, that lack of housing diversity has contributed to that for sure. So as Lisa said, the ALICE report is a financial hardship study, and the goal there is it's released every 2 years, I should say. It's something that we at the partnership look at and use regularly in our conversations and advocacy. I encourage you to visit alice.ctunitedway.org to download a copy of the report and read it. It's a wealth of information that really paints a picture of the challenges that these families are facing. And I would note, as you read that, consider the additional challenges borne by this particularly vulnerable population during these most challenging times. And as Lisa noted, according to the ALICE report, statewide, 38% of families fall below that ALICE threshold. That's nearly 4 out of every 10 households in our state are in that income constrained, asset limited position. And as Lisa noted, these are people we encounter every day. These are our essential workers in many cases, as we've been calling them of late. In previous reports, we've often held up the fact that childcare and housing combine to make up approximately 50% of the ALICE household survival budget. But in the 2020 report, researchers went beyond the challenges related to the expensive housing and looked at emerging trends around access to affordable housing. The cost of living continues to increase faster than many workers' wages in both urban and rural areas, often driven by the cost of housing. In Connecticut, rising costs in urban areas due to population growth and increasing demand for affordable housing have been challenges. And this is across our age bracket. This applies to both families with young children as well as our elderly population. We know that the housing needs exist in both rural and urban areas, that while access to transit is critical for some, it is not so for others. And so this housing diversity is truly needed across the state in so many of our towns. So while these are not new issues, as I mentioned, they've only been exacerbated by the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we see there the connection between what our homelessness system is experiencing and our affordable housing challenges. And that is, for folks who are no longer able to afford rent, they're forced to double up. For families who have lost income, they are at risk of eviction. We've had an eviction moratorium in place, which has been helpful, but folks owe a significant amount of arrearage, and there is a lot of pressure on those families. And as we see restrictions beginning to increase, there's an increased concern about safety. Our shelters have reduced their capacity, in some cases 50% or less, in order to create social distancing within. So those safety nets are also strained as well. So there's never been, I think, a better time to have a conversation about this. And I don't think there's been a time when the need for safe, affordable housing, as Lisa mentioned, has been more clear. So with that, let's pause to learn a little bit about affordable housing from our esteemed panelists. And I'll kick it off with our commissioner. with a big, broad question. So, Commissioner, tell us how you define affordable housing and why you see it as such an important element here in Connecticut.
Good morning, everyone. I always have to check my microphone. Never fails. Thank you, United Way, for inviting me. Thank you to my good friend Steve Diaz for remembering me and asked me to participate in this forum. So what is affordable housing and why is it so important? Kylie, you're asking me that question. Well, affordable housing as defined by HUD is housing that a household can obtain for 30% or less of their income. What if affordable? Well, it varies from city to city, determined by that municipality's area median income, or known as AMI. Complicated, a lot of information, but the AMI can be found on federal and state housing databases. The assumption is that if you pay 30% or less of your income, you could meet other essential needs, such as food, clothing, car, etc. Why it is so important? Well, having a place to live that you can afford in a community that you want, that is safe for you and your children, can have a huge impact in someone's life. For example, in my beginnings, my income was limited to minimum wages. So I was in the category that you are describing. I was an honest person. So within, so my income was limited to minimum wages. By having a decent, safe, affordable place to live, where I pay 30% of my income, allow me to continue my education. So I know firsthand the difference that a home makes in someone's life. Within this pillar of economic stability, housing is an extremely important component of the social determinants of health. When a person or a family is stably housed, we can usually point to access to healthcare, education, social and community well-being, and a well-developed and maintained neighborhood. This is why my department's mission is to ensure everyone has access to quality housing opportunities and options throughout the state. Having choices will really make an impact in someone's life.
Thanks, Commissioner. Thanks for sharing your story as well. Dr. Lyles, the Commissioner mentioned COVID and particularly what we often call the social determinants of health and housing being one of those. What has COVID-19 meant for residents in public housing?
Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity. So I'll get right to it. What it has meant for residents in public housing is that, one, they're working in potentially dangerous environments because many work in low-wage, part-time essential worker positions. They're bus aides, they're school aides, they're CNAs, retail workers, and childcare and the like. Also, it means there's an increased daily living cost from children being home all day. There's electricity has been increased, the need for food and the volume of food that they need has increased, and also non-essential items that you cannot buy with SNAP benefits and need to pay for with cash has increased. Additionally, it's been particularly a tough time to face the reality that internet should be a utility. And then also for residents living in low-income public housing, it also means that they come to the realization that they don't have equitable access to this utility. So another aspect, which is pretty significant, is that the reality that schools are woefully unprepared and underprepared to support families as partners in their children's education, especially if their children attend under-resourced schools. And then last, even within cities where there are poorly resourced schools, there exists this disparity between schools within the district. And this is a very poor time to realize that that disparity exists.
Thank you, Doctor. Yeah, you touched on so many important points and so many of the challenges that the ALICE group is facing. during this time, education challenges, internet challenges, all of these things that have been brought into sharper focus. I want to get back to that, but before we do, I wanted to double check to see if George has been able to join us yet. George, are you there? Okay. I think George is unable to join us today. So let me turn it back to Dr. Lyles then with a follow-up question before we come back to the commissioner. You talked about the residents of public housing, and I want to be clear that when we're talking about public housing, we're talking about a specific type of affordable housing, and there are many different types of housing that our affordable housing appeals list, for example, in Connecticut, that list that the Department of Housing puts out includes, which includes public housing, as well as units that are supported by state housing vouchers, CHAFA-funded home ownership units. But in particular, Dr. Lyles, around the area of public housing, can you talk a little bit more about who these residents are, why they're in public housing, and in your experience, what housing options are available to them based on household income?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks. So yes, I'm going to focus on a particular demographic in public housing. But in general, public housing, it looks like low income women of color as head of household. They are high school educated or still in need of attaining their high school diploma, and mothers. But they're also highly competent, strong, passionate about equity, and determined. So we need to make sure that we get a fuller picture of those who live in low income public housing, because we tend to go off the stereotype. But with that said, I'd like to add that there's also a good percentage of older persons and persons with disabilities living in low income public housing who often get overlooked due to this stereotype. So like I said, I'm gonna focus on the women who live in low income public housing. So they come into low income public housing and based on their education level, racial identity, and marriage status as single women, this society in America decided a long time ago that jobs for this demographic were going to be by and large low wage and non-union. So that's the first thing to consider when you think about who the face of public housing is. And then also, out of alignment with these types of jobs, these women also have decided to have families. And again, without really thinking about motherhood, single motherhood, low income public housing as women beyond, the young high school dropout single mom. They are not just that, and yet they are still in the same situation due to the fact that, like I said, the availability for jobs that pay a living wage for women with a high school education or yet to receive their high school diploma are very limited. Like I said, it's minimum wage, non-union, particularly part-time jobs or jobs where they have to, especially in this day and age, piecemeal a number of hours, significant hours throughout the week. So which make it nearly impossible for them to pay market rate rent, while also covering childcare costs, healthy food for all family members, transportation, and other household essentials, all of that on one paycheck. So even as their children get older, they must continue to work in order to maintain their household. And so along with the cost and time of higher education, to obtain a higher education, which would then allow them to earn a higher degree, considering the way in which this country rewards those with higher education. This opportunity is really disallowed to obtain a higher education degree in a consistent and continuous fashion because, again, the women living in low income public housing have to continually work in order to maintain their household. So the room for them to go back to school and consistently work and matriculate for that degree is extremely challenging. This also assumes that they have, if they're going to be on a trajectory of earning greater income in order to no longer live in low income public housing, this almost means that they have to have almost no credit card debt resulting from purchases that you and I take for granted. Desirable items like a freezer to house extra food that can last them through tough times, a washer and dryer to keep up with their laundry and save time out of the house, or materials so their children can take part in extracurricular activities. These are things that if you make the choice for those things, it may hinder your ability to save and use that money to again leave public housing. So what ends up happening is a lot of these women place a lot of their efforts in doing the best they can to make sure that their children have a better life and no longer need to live in public housing. But they're also doing this because they're accessing public housing, public health care, and government food benefits. Now, just for a little historical context, all of these things were encouraged in white women. In fact, low-income public housing was really encouraged for families, and it was seen as a stepping stone from living in the slums, and you were able to obtain public housing because it would afford you the ability to have healthy families. Again, we think about how white males were given full access to the GI Bill in order to have decent, safe, and affordable housing, and to be able to gain a foothold in earning income and assets in America. And we also know that corporations get plenty of tax breaks. But again, we have to understand that women living in low-income public housing do not have those opportunities, do not have that support to say, we invest in your family. These women also are providers for their extended families. So beyond their immediate family, they care for the elderly of their family, the grandchildren, uncles, their neighbors, and they are the relative that everyone goes to, these women who are the head of household in their families. So I want to say that how single mothers of color who live in low-income public housing, how they got there is really not their story. It's really the story of how we have devalued the motherhood of single mothers of color in this country, where once we looked to single white mothers whose husband died in the war as needing and worthy of public assistance, we then looked at those receiving public assistance who are increasingly Black single mothers as unworthy. Politically, single women went from the faces calling for empathy to faces warranting our open hostility. Therefore, how these amazing, strong, passionate, determined people who currently live in low-income public housing got there is really the story of how American politics made them the enemy of our tax dollars. It is a deliberate disinvestment in families because the composition no longer fits with our sense of womanhood. So to be clear, I'm speaking structurally and systemically here as I say this. But the housing options available to women in need of affordable housing is aligned with our open distaste for who they are. Low-income public housing is situated near environmentally toxic areas, near some of the most under-resourced schools, and some of the poorest quality housing available, fraught with issues of safety and security. So when we think of the faces and who is in public housing and what they have available to them, we have to remember that they are people like you and me. And the one thing I love about this Alice report and the idea behind it is that it really helps people understand that they are working people who have been put in a situation where our economics structurally have not been able to support them to live in decent, safe, and affordable housing, because we no longer look as housing as an essential item for all people in this country, just for those who can afford it.
Thank you so much, Doctor. That was a wonderful and impressive and very clear picture that you've outlined for us. And thank you so much for drawing attention to the racial barriers in devaluation, as you said, of people of color, and specifically a single female head of household, women who are really struggling. I think the components that you mentioned are that we all take, that many of us take for granted. Childcare, elderly care, making regular, simple purchases, and the challenges in downstream challenges that some of those things can create was really, really helpful. So thank you so much for bringing that to light. You touched on the topic of housing location. And that's something that I want to get back to even without our Guilford panelists here. We also talked about the pandemic earlier, and Dr. Lyles, you touched on that as well. And I think, in terms of access to healthcare, Dr. Lyles outlined that as a challenge, particularly for residents of affordable housing. The Department of Housing has had to be extremely creative, Commissioner, in stepping up to that challenge in the last 9 months, and that those Alice families, many of whom are living in public housing, as we just discussed, have been even further strained by the pandemic, either as a result of job loss, educational barriers and burdens that have been exacerbated by this, childcare concerns, the ability just to, as we've all experienced, get access to food and other basic services, healthcare being a huge one of those, taking care of other other members of their family during this time has been challenged. So the need for affordable housing and the need for that housing to be maintained during these times has never been more clear. So the COVID-19 pandemic, as we described, has really required that we create safe, socially distanced housing options for these individuals, particularly also for our vulnerable sheltered population, those folks for whom housing insecurity and instability has become a crisis without a roof over their head. And struggling to pay rent and mortgage for those not in homelessness, but as I mentioned, without access to employment or income or limited income. Can you talk about what the Department of Housing has been up to over the past 9 months in trying to support both existing residents of affordable housing through this pandemic, and also thinking forward in terms of the need for more affordable housing units here in the state?
Thank you, Kylie. Almost 10 months, right? But who is counting? It has been certainly a ride, ups and downs. But sure, in terms of housing options for our vulnerable shelter population, at the beginning of the pandemic, as you know, we worked closely with the CANs to decompress the shelters and moved more than 1,000 residents to hotels. We have made available approximately $40 million in combination of federal ESG, FEMA, CDBG, COVID, and state funds. These resources has been used for rapid rehousing, diversion, eviction prevention, cold weather conditions, hotel rooms, camp staff, food, and hazard pay. In addition to the hotel rooms, the CANs have continued placing individuals and families into permanent housing, which is one of our main goals. For those residents that were housed but lost their jobs, the Department of Housing established the Temporary Rental Housing Assistance Program to assist those individuals who have demonstrated financial hardship due to the pandemic. In collaboration with CHAFA, 11 housing counseling agencies, the workplace, and alone servicing, we were able to use approximately $27 million to assist more than 6,000 renters. These payments were made directly to landlords. It took a while to get the process going. With no infrastructure, we had to create a system on the go to assist homeowners that were not able to obtain forbearance from the federal government. The Connecticut Housing Finance Authority established the Temporary Mortgage Assistance Program as another financial resource to homeowners that demonstrated financial hardship due to the pandemic. With the most recent stimulus package, the state is anticipated to receive about $237 million. That money comes with new eligibility and reporting requirements, so we're still evaluating the most efficient way to deploy those resources. It has not been easy. We did not have a roadmap to respond to multiple needs, but I have to say that the collaboration with our partners and other state departments has made the difference in our work. I'm very grateful for my staff, for many of our partners, including the Partnership for Strong Communities, the CANs, the nonprofits, the housing counseling. Everybody stepped out to the plate. And you got to remember that the pandemic is not only affecting the people that need housing, it was also affecting our staff. Some of my staff have death in their families, but they still showed up for work because they really cared, and everybody was feeling the emergency where we were in trying to avoid people to be out of their homes. So we will continue doing that. We will continue collaborating, and I hope everybody continues working with us and trying to be creative with the resources that we have.
Thanks, Commissioner. Yeah, and I think it's important to note, as you touched on, that both the individuals at the Department of Housing, and for those of you who don't know, the Department of Housing is a very small department of 40 or so individuals that is leveraging and trying to manage enormous amounts of assets and to take on the scale of new resources that the department has coming through it is related to COVID, and trying to support residents while still pushing forward new development is incredibly challenging. And so thank you to the Department of Housing and to the Commissioner for continuing to focus on that. But also highlights another issue, which is that many of our service providers fall into this ALICE category. So Lisa mentioned at the top of the hour, bus drivers, some of our essential workers like nurses, teachers, daycare providers, elderly care providers, fall into that category. And so do folks assisting individuals who are in this, either in low-income housing, in public housing, working in those places, but also supporting our individuals who are in shelter, working in shelters, working on the front line right now, case managers, and food prep folks. A lot of the volunteers that have normally served that have been unable to serve that population, have been unable to be there. But I think that it is critical to note that many of the individuals who are lifting these populations up are themselves ALICE individuals and themselves receiving many of the benefits that we're talking about here today. So this is an entire system, an entire population of individuals, and as Dr. Lyles noted, disproportionately people of color that are being that are in more of a crisis mode than usual with the pandemic. So, Commissioner, before I go back to Dr. Lyles, I wanted to follow what you just talked about a little bit, and think about moving forward as we move forward into the coming months of this pandemic. There's been an eviction moratorium in place, as we all know. That expires on February 9th. And while there still have been individuals that have been evicted, either because they fall into one of the carve-outs for that moratorium for other reasons, evictions have been down in the state, and that eviction moratorium has been helping to prevent folks with large arrearages from finding themselves with nowhere to go. Commissioner, do you expect that moratorium to continue beyond the 9th? And then could you also tell us a little bit about the new resources coming in from the federal government for rent relief and the future of that those resources and how they might be implemented?
Thank you, Kylie. Well, conversation about an extension of the eviction moratorium are happening between the governors, our office, and legislators leaders. I do know that Senator Onward, former chair and now current vice chair of the Housing Committee, has put forward a proposed bill to extend the eviction moratorium. However, that is in the early stages of the legislative process and does not have bill language attached to it. You may also know that Biden's administration has included eviction and foreclosure moratorium until September 2021 in the new proposed COVID relief plan. DOH has established an eviction prevention program specifically designed for households that are either facing eviction or currently within the eviction process. We have partnered with the Kansas Quinnipiac Mediation Clinic, Legal Aid, and with the 211, which is run by United Way, to assist those individuals that in the meantime, while these moratoriums are being extended or worked out for an extension, they can have some assistance. So I also think the governor is having conversation with the legislator for extension of the emergency order. So there will be some type of extensions. We have to see, but that's the hope. With regards to the new resource that is coming to the state, the $237 million, as I said, the treasurer actually is still is going to issue some revisions to some of the requirements they have established. They will give us clarifications. We are working diligent to make sure that while we wait for those revisions, which is more online of what is income verification, how do we keep track and verify some of those requirements, that we can make it a little easier. So we hope that within 3 to 4 weeks, we should be able to run the new program, which is intended to be a little more automated. As I said, it's very challenging to have to require documentation while people cannot go to offices and while we have this pandemic.
Thanks so much, Commissioner. We'll get back to the pandemic towards the end of our program. I want to go back to what Dr. Lyles was describing, though, in terms of the challenges that are facing residents of affordable housing throughout the state. And Dr. Lyles, you spoke quite eloquently about the racial disparities that we see in our populations of individuals, both in need of affordable housing and those in affordable housing, and then how that's been exacerbated by the pandemic. And you also did a great job of explaining some of the reasons why we see these racial disparities, that systemic racism and white dominant culture and legal barriers, as you described, like access to GI funding and a variety of other housing funding sources have historically denied communities of color the wealth building opportunities that we've seen for white families in our nation's history, as well as, again, policies enshrined in law like redlining throughout our nation's history and here in Connecticut. And we see, as I mentioned, that segregation still strongly in effect here in the state of Connecticut, being the most racially segregated state in the country. So the question I have here in front of me is about investing in empowering residents to advocate for themselves and find their own workable solutions. But it strikes me that there's quite a bit more that we should be thinking about here and doing, and really trying to dismantle some of the systems that have resulted in these disparities and continue to prevent wages from rising and allowing individuals, in many cases, from moving up the economic ladder. What are some of those steps that you feel the state of Connecticut should be thinking about at an economic level, and also in terms of dismantling racist systems and systemic racism here within Connecticut that can help residents, existing residents of affordable housing, as well as those who need it?
Thank you. I really appreciate these questions. And I would say one of the things that is a real hurdle that people don't think about is that the public perception of women living in low-income public housing as welfare queens instead of working mothers. So one of the things we can do within the general public, but also politically, is really think about who lives in public housing and think about them as working families, which they are. Again, we have a significant population of disabled persons, which disallow them the ability to work in significantly, but they're also really significant amount of working families. So we need to align our public perception with the reality of who lives in public housing. So then that will help foster legislation that is, again, aligned with who's really there. Because right now, our public legislation really thinks about the people who live in public housing as, again, that stereotype of the welfare queen. And so that also means, to push this point further, is that there's a political disinvestment in entities like HUD, who should be properly funding PHAs, local public housing authorities, so that residents can live in decent, safe, and affordable housing. The fact that living in public housing means that you are only required to spend 30% of your gross income towards your rental costs is a darn good thing. And it's something that we actually are looking for across the board. Affordable housing should be a right for all of us. And we should really all make sure that we all can truly live in decent, safe, and affordable housing without the need to spend over 50% of our income, or up to 50% of our income in that. So the other thing that is a need and to think about in terms of what residents need in terms of advocacy is a need for basic quality of life items, such as mold-free apartments, proper garbage receptacles, access to their mail, people-centered policies around parking, access to safe community space, and many other items that renters and homeowners take for granted. We need to consider that those who live in public housing should have the same rights as those of us who live outside of public housing. And so one thing that can happen in the state of Connecticut is that we need to add low-income public housing residents issues to our advocacy agendas. So we need to find out what those are. And then also add housing to your understanding of systemic oppression. It's a very significant piece of it, and not just thinking in terms of home ownership, but across the board and thinking about housing for all. And gain knowledge of how oppression operates by inviting low-income public housing residents to your table at the inception of your discussions around your organization's budget. Speak with people before you push your legislative agenda. Really get them at the table so that they can help shape your agenda. And then see them tied to your own liberation, not as charity. I can tell you that people who live in low-income public housing do not want to be your charity case. So let's stop thinking about them like that and start thinking about them as our neighbors. And then also provide direct funding to grassroots groups, as well as direct funding to partnerships that exist between larger nonprofits and grassroots groups who do the work around not only housing, but education and healthcare, which are really intimately tied to housing. So we want to make sure that large nonprofits operate in cooperation with grassroots at the root where people live and where people are, really work in partnership with people and not just as a parental unit.
Thank you so much. So eloquently stated. I mentioned in my opening remarks that we have some extremely old housing stock that are rental housing, because we as a state have been, and our towns have been largely adverse in many cases to producing multifamily housing in many of the last decades. Much of our multifamily housing stock is extremely old, and that goes for public housing too. One other, I think, thing that's worth noting here is that deed restricted affordable housing, public housing in particular, as Dr. Lyles was describing, has deed restrictions tied to it that expire over time. And so those are usually in place for 15 to 30 years. And so as properties reach the end of that deed restriction timeline, and depending on the market, they can be at risk for becoming market rate units. But aside from that, we've seen the quality of our affordable housing and of our public housing decline over time. And that lack of investment piece that Dr. Lyles described is true. As we know, and as the commissioner well knows, there's funding for new affordable housing, and there's also a pool of funding for preserving existing affordable housing, but there's never as much of it as we truly need. And so we have statistics from our friends at Park in Cheshire that take a look at public housing resources and note that in the state of Connecticut, we're at risk of losing 5,000 affordable housing units a year unless we can rehab those units and re-up their affordable housing requirements and bring them up to quality code and providing folks with basic resources like internet at this point. So thank you, Dr. Lyle, for bringing those up. Pivoting a little bit here to talk about trends and actions. I just mentioned investing more in our state-supported housing portfolio. And Dr. Lyles mentioned really bringing folks with housing instability and lived experience to the table as partners. What are some trends or policies that we should be aware of, Dr. Lyle, before I go back to the commissioner? You mentioned some, but what are some other sort of trends we should be aware of, maybe associated with the, with the pandemic, or concerning trends that you're seeing in your work that need to be addressed that are going unnoticed at this point in time?
Well, thank you. So to put a finer point on it, I'd just like to say that there's a lot of promising partnerships happening between grassroots organizations like the one where I work, PT Partners, and larger organizations like the local United Way of Coastal Fairfield County here in Bridgeport. And so that's really great to see that this pandemic has really opened the opportunity for those who work directly at the ground with people who are the people on the ground working with these larger nonprofits in a true partnership. So that's really, really exciting. The other thing that we're excited about is some of the work of people like Eric Stanley out of Fairfield County Community Foundation. So Fairfield County Community Foundation, where she is really working to find a local voice and local power and place it in the conversation around housing and urban communities. Also, Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity is working to address how we speak when we speak about affordable housing, and Open Communities Alliance is opening conversations around the deep history of housing and equity in Connecticut and what that means for us now. So I'm excited about those things.
Thanks. Commissioner, I'll give you the last word here. I will note, unfortunately, we didn't get to dive into sort of the planning and zoning and local barrier conversation, what some towns are doing to encourage development without our friends from Guilford today. So I'll put that ball in your court if there's anything you would like to share on that. But as a closing question, how do you feel affordable housing provides opportunities for individuals and families, and how can we best support that here in Connecticut?
Thank you, Kylie. So I believe that having options and being able to choose where to live, where to raise a family can provide many opportunities. The decision should not be based solely on affordability. One should be able to afford to live in Guilford just as easily as in New Haven, and vice versa. Income levels should not be the sole determinant of where someone can live. One should be able to choose where to live based on family needs, desires, and aspirations such as school system, access to transportation, jobs, etc. To help ensure that affordable housing is available to all, we are at the Department of Housing are working on 3 priorities. And I will mention it really quick because I know that we are about to end. 1, implement a balanced approach to capital investments. That means investing in neighborhood revitalization, in working in collaboration with several of our other agencies like DECD, education, transportation, energy, and environmental protection. New construction in high opportunity communities. Rehabilitation and preservation, as you mentioned before, we have an old housing stock that we need to invest. Activities designed to afford new opportunity for homeownership, as well as to help promote ownership stability. Second, continue commitment of resources to prevent and address homelessness. And third, promote community development, including economic stabilization and infrastructure investment in our smaller towns and cities. So as an example of that, we do have a guide that we put together with the planning, the Regional Plan Association, and is out. I think we share the link, and many of our attendees can look at that, where we provide guidance in how to develop an affordable housing plan. So with that, Kylie, thank you very much for inviting me. This has been great. And thank you very much for continuing advocating for affordable housing.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us today. That RPA resource, I think that the commissioner mentioned, is on the DOH website. It's also on our website at pschousing.org. I mentioned the link already for the ALICE report, and the partnership also just released housing data profiles, which allows you to look town by town at your town's housing data. So I'll just conclude by saying, if you know someone who is searching for assistance, please use the United Ways 211 number. It is the front door of our homeless service system. It is also a great way to connect individuals with housing resources. You can also visit 211ct.org for quick access to other resources. They've been an invaluable partner throughout the pandemic in helping to release rental assistance too. You can also show your support for ALICE households by giving to your local United Way. United Ways across the state are committed to ensuring that every child and individual and family has the opportunity to succeed. And this includes investing in programs and services and initiatives related to affordable housing, homelessness, and the COVID-19 pandemic. There's also opportunities to get involved in virtual volunteer opportunities throughout the United Way. We hope that you'll help us spread the word about the 2020 ALICE report. It is a wonderful resource. I really strongly encourage you to look at it and think about some of the challenges facing our state and communities, and activate at the local level to help raise those up to the state level for policy change. No one organization alone can solve the complex issues addressed in the report or that we talked about here today. but there's power in coming together like we did this morning and sharing information. And so that's what United Ways and many of the partners here, Dr. Lyles, myself, and the commissioner, I know, are committed to doing. So I encourage you to save the date for the third United Way virtual town hall series. That's going to be on March 25th at 5:30 p.m., exploring the cost of healthcare. Until then, stay safe and be well. Thank you. Have a great day and live united.